They said it casually, like it was already decided, already documented, already theirs. A room full of people, laptops open, eyes shifting between slides and faces. The kind of meeting where tone matters more than facts, until facts arrive. She didn't argue, didn't interrupt, just listened. Because sometimes the most expensive words are the ones spoken too early. 4 minutes. That's all it would take to turn certainty into liability, and ownership into exposure. The room had that polished stillness typical of executive floors, glass walls, controlled lighting, silence that felt intentional rather than natural. Even the air seemed filtered through hierarchy. On the screen, lines of code, clean, structured, familiar, too familiar. This, the VP said, tapping the display with a pen like a judge finalizing a verdict, belongs to the company. There was no hesitation in his voice, no room for interpretation, just a statement, framed as fact, delivered as closure. A few people nodded, not because they agreed, but because that's what the room required. Agreement wasn't always about truth. Sometimes it was about alignment. She stood near the end of the table, not defensive, not reactive. Still. And that stillness was noticed, because it didn't match the moment. Most people would explain, defend, correct. She didn't. She simply looked at the screen, not like someone being accused, but like someone recognizing something already accounted for, already positioned. Any objections? The VP added, scanning the room, his tone sharpening just enough to signal expectation rather than inquiry. Silence answered him, but not the kind he thought he controlled. Across the table, someone shifted. Another glanced at their notes, then quickly away. The legal counsel hadn't spoken yet, which in rooms like this meant more than if they had, because silence from the right person is rarely empty. The VP leaned back slightly, confident now. The statement had landed. The room had absorbed it. Ownership established. Narrative closed. Or so it seemed. She finally moved, not forward, not back. Just enough to reach her laptop. A small motion. Measured. Intentional. The kind of motion that doesn't interrupt a moment, but prepares the next one. And somewhere in that quiet shift, the structure of the room changed, almost imperceptibly. Because what everyone else saw as a conclusion, she recognized as a starting point. And in systems like this, beginnings are rarely announced. They're triggered. The CTO, who had remained unusually quiet until now, glanced once at the screen, then at her. Not with concern, with interest. That subtle technical curiosity that appears only when something doesn't align with expectation. "Send me the reference," he said calmly, without looking away. She didn't respond immediately. Just one click, one file, one identifier. No explanation attached. Because explanation was about to become unnecessary. And in that exact moment, the certainty in the room didn't disappear. It tightened. Like something about to be tested. Because when ownership is declared too early, verification becomes inevitable. And verification has no loyalty. The screen didn't change immediately. That, in itself, was unusual. In most meetings, transitions are smooth. Slides advance, narratives align, momentum is maintained. But here, there was a pause. Not technical, structural. The CTO didn't rush. He opened the file the way engineers open things they don't fully trust, without assumption, without commentary, without performance. Just precision. A window appeared, then another. Repository logs, metadata, timestamps, the language of systems, quiet, exact, immune to interpretation. "Let's verify origin," he said, almost to himself. Not a challenge, a process. The VP shifted slightly in his chair. Subtle, controlled, but visible. Because the room had changed. Not dramatically. Nothing obvious, nothing theatrical. But the center of gravity had moved, away from statements, toward evidence. Click. The first record loaded. Creation date. Earlier than expected. Earlier than the project itself. A detail small enough to ignore. Unless you knew what it implied. Another click. Author field. A name appeared. Not the company. Not the team. Her. No reaction from her side of the table. None needed. Because the system was speaking now. And systems don't speculate. They reveal. Check the external registry. The CTO added, still calm, still neutral. But now, focused. Another window, another query. And this time the pause was longer. Not because of delay, because of recognition. Patent database. Entry ID 991-24C. Status, active. Ownership, individual. Filed prior to integration. Silence didn't fall into the room. It assembled, piece by piece. The VP leaned forward now, the confidence in his posture tightening into something less stable, less certain. That doesn't... he started, but didn't finish. Because there are moments when interruption doesn't just fail. It exposes. The CTO turned the screen slightly. Not dramatically, not confrontationally, just enough. So everyone could see. Ownership is external, he said. No emphasis, no tone, just fact. And in that moment, the original statement, confident, public, absolute, didn't collapse. It inverted. From control to liability. Because if the company didn't own the code, then the code running inside its systems was operating under a dependency it didn't control. Legal shifted in their chair, not out of discomfort, out of calculation. Because this wasn't about credit anymore. It was about exposure. And exposure, in rooms like this, is measured in time. How long it existed, how widely it was used, how visible it might become. The VP didn't speak again. Not immediately. Because now every word required verification. Every assumption required trace. Every conclusion required proof. And the room was no longer built for speed. It was built for accuracy. The CTO closed one window, left another open. The patent record. Visible, undeniable, quiet. And that quiet carried more weight than any argument that had come before. Because once a system confirms something like this, it doesn't just answer the question. It changes the question. Not who owns the code, but what else? Have we been assuming incorrectly? And that question doesn't stop at one file. It spreads. If you've ever seen a room shift like this, not with noise, but with one quiet verification, you already know how rare these moments are. Because real control isn't declared. It's revealed. And sometimes, 4 minutes is all it takes to rewrite years of assumptions. No one closed their laptops. That was the first sign this wasn't over. In most meetings, once a conclusion is reached, even an uncomfortable one, people begin to disengage. Screens dim. Notes are saved. The room prepares to dissolve. Not this time. Because nothing had concluded. It had only opened. Legal was already moving. Not physically, not in any visible, disruptive way. But the shift was there. Subtle, procedural, immediate. Scope of integration? One of them asked. Voice level, almost detached. A simple question, with expensive implications. The CTO didn't answer right away. Instead, he navigated deeper. Dependencies, modules, connection points. The architecture unfolded layer by layer, like a system reluctantly revealing its own map. Core functions, he said finally, not isolated. Another pause, this one heavier, because not isolated meant embedded, and embedded meant everywhere. The VP leaned back again, but this time the movement lacked its earlier certainty. It wasn't control anymore. It was distance. A quiet attempt to step away from something already moving. Can it be replaced? Someone from finance asked. The kind of question that tries to convert risk into numbers. The CTO exhaled slightly. Not frustration, not hesitation, calculation. Not quickly, which in operational language meant not without cost, not without disruption, not without attention. And attention was exactly what this room had just activated. She remained where she had been the entire time, still, unmoved. But now that stillness had a different weight. Before, it looked passive. Now, it read as control. Because while the room was catching up, she had never been behind. The patent record still sat open on the screen. Quiet, precise, indifferent to the tension it had created. 991-24C, just a number. But numbers in the right context become leverage. Legal turned slightly toward her, not confrontationally, not defensively, professionally. Was there an agreement in place for internal use? They asked. There it was. The first direct acknowledgement that this wasn't hypothetical, that this wasn't a misunderstanding, that this was real. She looked at them. Calm, composed, exact. No assignment clause, she said. 4 words, clear, contained, irreversible. Another shift in the room, because absence in legal frameworks is never neutral. It's directional. And this absence pointed somewhere very specific, toward her, toward control that had never actually been transferred. The VP's gaze dropped briefly to the table. Just a fraction of a second. But long enough. Because in rooms like this, loss of eye contact isn't about uncertainty. It's about recalculation. The narrative he introduced, no longer held. And without a narrative, authority becomes procedural, limited, conditional. The CTO minimized a window, opened another. Usage logs, scale, reach. Internal systems linked to the code, external touchpoints. Each line adding quiet weight to the same conclusion. This wasn't a minor component. This was infrastructure. And infrastructure, when externally owned, is not just a technical detail. It's a structural dependency. Exposure timeline? Legal asked next. Short question. Long consequences. The CTO's fingers paused over the keyboard. Not because he didn't know, because he did. And that knowledge required precision. From initial deployment, he said, continuous. Silence followed, but not the earlier kind. This one wasn't forming. It was settling, like dust after something shifts at a deeper level. Because now the question wasn't whether there was a problem. It was how long the problem had existed, and how visible it might become. She closed her laptop. Softly. No rush. No signal. Just an action. But in that action, something finalized. Not in the system. In the room. Because while they were still mapping the implications, she had already measured them. And more importantly, positioned them. The patent number remained on the screen, unmoved, unchallenged, and quietly redefining everything around it. Because in environments like this, ownership isn't just about what you build. It's about when you chose not to give it away. And that decision had just become visible. No one asked her to leave. That was the second sign. Because in situations that tilt toward legal exposure, the instinct is usually containment. Reduce variables, limit voices, regain structure. But here, removing her would only remove clarity. And clarity, right now, was the only stable element in the room. Let's outline current dependency, Legal said, shifting the conversation from discovery to control. A necessary move. Too late to prevent the issue. Just in time to define it. The CTO projected a new layer of the system. Not code this time, but relationships. Modules linked to modules, services feeding into services. A network. Dense. Interconnected. Unforgiving. Primary pipeline runs through this segment, he pointed. which references her implementation. A small phrase, her implementation. But in this context, ownership wasn't theoretical anymore. It was operational. Revenue exposure? Finance asked again, this time more directly. No hesitation now. No abstraction. Because once a risk is confirmed, numbers become unavoidable. The CTO didn't answer. He didn't need to. Finance was already calculating. Subscriptions, active users, contracts tied to system performance. Every line connected in some way to that same underlying layer. The room didn't react outwardly, but the silence recalibrated, from curiosity to containment. The VP finally spoke. Then we formalize ownership, he said, tone firmer now. Not as confident as before, but sharper, more directive. We integrate it under company IP retroactively if needed. It sounded decisive, strategic, almost corrective. But something about it didn't land, because authority doesn't rewrite history, and systems, especially legal ones, don't accept retroactive assumptions without resistance. Legal didn't respond immediately, which, again, said everything. They weren't rejecting the idea. They were measuring it against reality, against documentation, against the one thing that had already been verified, 991-24C. Retroactive integration requires assignment, legal said carefully, and assignment requires consent. A pause. Short. Exact. And compensation, they added. There it was. Not a barrier. A condition. The VP's jaw tightened slightly, not visibly enough to call out, but enough to register, because the conversation had shifted again, from control to negotiation, and negotiation implies position. He turned to her, finally, directly. For clarity, he said, tone controlled. You developed this prior to joining? A question framed as confirmation, a chance to stabilize the narrative. She met his gaze. No tension, no hesitation. Yes, just that. No elaboration, no defense. Because facts, once established, don't need reinforcement. They stand. The VP nodded once, slowly, processing, reframing, calculating next steps. But every option now had constraints: legal, financial, temporal, and perhaps most critically, visible, because this wasn't contained anymore. Too many people in the room, too many systems involved, too much already logged. Then we discussed terms, he said. A pivot, subtle, necessary, but late. Because negotiation isn't strongest at the moment of discovery, it's strongest before it. And that moment had passed. She didn't respond, not immediately. Instead, she looked once at the screen, at the architecture, at the layers now being mapped in real time, at the system that had quietly depended on something it didn't own. Then back at him, calm, precise, measured. The terms, she said, were already defined. Another pause. Different this time. Because this wasn't a reaction. It was a reminder. Something pre-existing. Something documented. Something overlooked. Legal's attention sharpened instantly. Defined where? They asked. And for the first time since the meeting began, she allowed the smallest shift in tone. Not emotion, not pressure, just timing. In the filing. No one spoke, because everyone understood what that meant. The patent wasn't just ownership. It was structure, conditions, scope, rights, limitations. Everything the room was now trying to negotiate had already been written. And in that realization, something subtle but critical happened. Control didn't change hands. It clarified where it had always been. The VP didn't interrupt again, didn't assert, didn't reframe. Because the room had moved past declarations into something far less flexible. Documentation, and documentation, doesn't negotiate with assumptions. It replaces them. The CTO closed the architecture view, left only one thing on the screen, 991-24C. Still, exact, final. And in that quiet focus, the meeting reached a point no one had planned for. Not a breakdown, not a conflict, a transition. From internal discussion to external reality. Because once something like this is confirmed, the system doesn't ask what you prefer. It asks what you're bound to. And that distinction changes everything. Следующая глава 6.6. Chapter 5. No one suggested a break. No one checked the time. Because time at this point had stopped behaving like something linear. It had compressed. Everything that mattered was happening now. Legal closed their notebook. Not as an ending, as a signal. We need to formalize status immediately, they said, before any further system interaction continues under current assumptions. Translation: what was running could no longer run the same way. The CTO understood instantly. He didn't argue, didn't delay. Just nodded once and began isolating processes, not shutting them down, but containing them, creating boundaries where none had existed before. Because once ownership is uncertain, access becomes a liability. Across the table, finance had already shifted into scenario modeling. Worst case, projected loss, operational disruption. Each scenario heavier than the last, but none of them theoretical anymore. Because the dependency was real. And now, acknowledged. The VP remained silent, not out of strategy, out of constraint, because every move available to him now required alignment with something outside his control. Documentation, law, timing. And the one variable he hadn't accounted for, her. She stood exactly where she had been since the beginning, unmoved. But now the room moved around her. Decisions, calculations, containment protocols, all orbiting a fact that hadn't changed since minute one. The code was never theirs, and systems once corrected don't revert to assumption. They stabilize around truth. Until an agreement is executed, legal continued, usage must be evaluated under external ownership conditions. Another translation, everything running, was now conditional. The CTO paused for a brief moment, not uncertainty, but alignment. Then we reduce active reliance, he said. Gradually. Carefully chosen word. Gradually. Because immediate removal wasn't possible. Not without impact. Not without consequence. Not without visibility. And visibility was no longer something this situation could avoid. The patent record still sat on the screen, 991-24C, unchanged, unaffected by the urgency around it. Because external reality doesn't accelerate just because internal pressure increases. It waits and forces you to adjust. The VP finally exhaled, slow, controlled, then looked at her again, not as opposition, not even as a variable, as a factor, a fixed one. What are you proposing? He asked. Direct, measured, late. She didn't respond immediately, not because she needed time, because she chose the moment. A glance at legal, at the CTO, at the system now being restructured in real time, then back at him. The system, she said, was designed with this boundary. A pause. Small, exact. Continued use requires alignment with it. No numbers, no demands, no negotiation posture, just structure, the kind that already exists before anyone decides to acknowledge it. Legal didn't need clarification. They understood, because alignment in this context meant formal recognition, licensing, terms, conditions, everything the room had tried to bypass, by assumption. The CTO leaned back slightly, not in relief, in clarity, because the technical problem was now secondary. The system wasn't broken. It was correct. It had always been correct. The misunderstanding was ownership. Finance stopped typing. Legal stopped writing. Even the ambient noise of the room, air systems, distant movement, quiet clicks, seemed to withdraw. Because the situation had reached its final shape. Not resolution, definition. And definition in environments like this is the point of no return. The VP nodded once, slowly, accepting something he couldn't reframe. Then we proceed formally, he said. A decision, but not his, just the only one remaining. She closed the distance to the table by a single step, not to assert, not to claim, just to finalize presence. And for the first time, the room didn't feel like a place where something was being debated. It felt like a place where something had been recognized. Because nothing here had changed in the last 4 minutes. Not the code. Not the patent. Not the system. Only one thing had shifted. Understanding. And understanding, once aligned with reality, doesn't leave room for interpretation. Only action. The screen dimmed slightly as the system idled. The patent number still visible. 991-24C. Quiet. Precise. Unmoved. Like everything that had always been true. Just waiting for the right moment to be seen.